very much. Let's see, is this mic on? And do you think that you will need a mic? Let's see. Yes? Yeah, we don't need a mic, but we do need a mic. Okay. I'll try to talk so that you can understand me, and complain loudly if you can't hear me at any point, and I'll do something about it. Yeah, so thanks very much for coming to 2 talks today. I realize if you're trying to get work done, it's not easy to come to 2 talks, and so thanks for coming to the 2nd talk, and I'll try to make it worth your time. I'm really happy to be able to be here at UC Merced, and this is part of, a couple years back, I invited Teeny Matlock to come speak at Emory. I was teaching a course on cognitive science and fiction, and so this is the reciprocal part of that exchange. I'm very glad to be here. Okay, the work that I'm going to be talking about is a project I've come to through my teaching, really, and I've been working on it now for the past, 7 years. And it'll be published next summer by Oxford University Press as a book in their narrative psychology series. So, need to see the context of this project. In 1986, I crossed over, I don't know if I like this metaphor, we may be able to come up with a better metaphor. I was a grad student in neuroscience at UCSF, and that fall became a grad student in comparative literature someplace else. And let's see, I guess I am going to need my glasses. I'm new to glasses, and I always feel like I'm in a goldfish bowl when I have to put them on and I'm separated from the world. But it is nice to be able to see people and see what's on the screen, so I guess I'm going to have to just deal with that. So here's a starting point of this project. As a result of having worked with a lot of people in many different fields, I've noticed that people vary in the relationships that they have with verbal language. I've come across people who the affinity to verbal language is so intense that they can't imagine what thinking might be if it weren't that. And I've come across people who feel that verbal language does violence to their thought, and it's like putting it through a sausage machine or into a cuisine art. So I was at a conference, this was a history of neuroscience conference, and someone who's a neurologist made a straight out throwaway thing: language is linear, visual images are nonlinear. And I said, are you sure? And he said, well, is it that you don't understand what nonlinear means? I think for some people, when they talk about verbal language, they use words like plodding. It just sort of goes along in a single stream, and there's no way around it, and you can't, it's just not an efficient way to communicate information. Literary scholars tend to have a different relationship with language, or creative writers, and just as an example, I wanted to offer you a passage from James Joyce's The Dead. I won't, in the interest of time, I won't read it all out loud, so just take a second and read it for yourselves. I think what's happening in this passage is that he's using language to create this image of the whirling snow. The word falling appears, I think, 4 times in this passage, and the way he's using language, rather than transmitting a stream of information, he's sending you, every word sends you in many possible directions. And in a longer fictional work, especially, every time you hear a word or a phrase, it may remind you of other times that phrase was used in the work. Just so that for people who work with language as literature, they're less likely to think of it as an inefficient stream for transmitting information. Okay, so here's some claims I've heard from people about language. One person told me, I'm going to be presenting some quotations from interview-based research in this talk, and since I've read the paper, you probably know who everybody is, but and in my IRB, people gave permission to be quoted in, say, published works, but I wasn't smart enough to think in advance if I could use their names in talks, and so I'm not using people's names in talks. So So a translator said, you know, I'm really suspicious of people who are uncomfortable with language. You know, that was kind of a radical statement to me. I was surprised by that. And a scientist said, you know, I really don't understand something or know my point of view until I write it in words. And so these are people who I think feel comfortable with verbal language. You know, they feel that it is allowing them to express what they want to say. It's enabling rather than disabling. I also spoke to people for whom language is really a confounding squalid nuisance. A physicist said, well, if I really want to understand what's going on, if I actually want to think about something, I've got to get down to a level below language. And I said, well, what's that supposed to mean? And he said, well, I associate language with my lungs, because that's kind of where it comes out of. And so a level below language is down in my gut, and I have to think in my gut if I'm thinking about what's actually happening. And then, then the hard part, to explain to everybody else what I've figured out, then I got to go back into language again, and that's where problems start to come in. Another person who works with complex systems said, language, it offers you these convenient labels, and you think that you understand things because you're tossing these labels around, but you really don't know what's going on. The label may actually be misleading. It may encourage you to think about things in one way, but you really should be asking very different sorts of questions. And then a geoscientist told me, you have a new idea and you're stuck with this language. Sometimes these words have been coined in English 500 years ago or more, and this is the term that you're going to use to explain this thing that you've just discovered. So there are real problems. To compound that, cultural scholar W.J.T. Mitchell and Ellen Ezra, who was his student, have both talked about biases against images in Western culture. I mean, this goes back to religion. Thou shalt make no graven images, and there's just a suspicion of images that they're kind of sensual and indulgent, and they don't really get at the truth of things. And if you want to build real knowledge and really get in contact with God, you've got to use words. So I think there's something to that. That explains. It doesn't fully explain, but I think the religious sources explain a little bit why there's this bias in favor of verbal language. Okay, so I decided at one point, most of my scholarship since I left the lab has involved reading books and articles and creating other books and articles. And I finally got fed up with this, and I've got to talk to people. I've got to get out into the world and talk to people. And so I decided to be brave and try interview-based research. And since I saw the specificity of the questions that you were giving to the earlier speaker today, I want to say in advance, I have no training in the social sciences. I have not been taught how to do interview-based research. I had to teach myself. Obviously, I talked to people who do it. Obviously, I learned what an IRB is and actually did one. And got permission to do this research, but it's not designed with the same finesse, say, as people who have rigorous training in this field. I was kind of learning by doing. I hope that I've still made a valid contribution to human knowledge, but there's some looseness in this design. So my goals were, first, the scientific goal. I wanted to study how the felt experience of thought varies from one person to another. Okay, so what's thought? A lot of different things, problem solving, planning, imagining, remembering to some degree. I'm defining it in a fairly loose way, but I am excluding unconscious thought. I understand that most mental activity is unconscious rather than conscious. I'm focusing on the conscious aspects of thought and things of which people are aware, with the understanding that this doesn't necessarily reveal what's going on in brains. What you experience during your thinking is not necessarily going to reveal everything that your brain is doing, but I think it's still worth studying. Then there's a literary dimension to this project too. I ended up creating a portrait of everybody that I spoke to, about a 3 to 5 page portrait. The same way that you might create a portrait of a character. The aim is it's a being John Malkovich kind of aim. I want to take people into the heads of all the different participants and give them a sense of what it feels like to live there, what it's like to think in this head. People, I make bathroom jokes about thinking that said, we don't know what it's like to go to the bathroom for everybody else. We presume that the process is somewhat similar to what we experience, but we don't talk about it. We don't ask people about it. And so thinking is the same way. How do you know what it's like for somebody else to think? And there's not that much exchange of information about that. And then finally, so I've created these portraits to help take people into people's heads. And that didn't come through in the article you read. The article you read had kind of snippets, but in the book there's going to be a portrait of everybody I talked to. And finally, I want to create a dialogue in which people's insights about their own minds and actual laboratory studies of the kind which you are doing are equal partners. There's so many books coming out nowadays where there'll be a famous person says something, and now neuroscience will explain what's actually going on. And I wanted people to be able to challenge the laboratory studies, but also the laboratory studies to be able to challenge the claims that people are making and create some kind of dialogue or some kind of resonance between them where nobody has the last word. I don't know whether it'll work or not, but that's what I was hoping to do. So I used the snowball technique, which is why this is here. I spoke to 34 people, and I'm sure that you're all going to, who were they? Where did you find them? So I started with people to nobody I knew intimately, but people with whom I had some kind of contact. I was especially interested in laboratory scientists and people who work with literature in some capacity. So there are lab scientists here, there are poets, engineers, fiction writers, literary scholars, there's a flamenco dancer, a game designer, web designer. They tend to be creative people. They do not represent all of humanity. I mean, not even close, not even ballpark. I conducted the interviews in English. Most of these people were American. They weren't all rich, but they had, they achieved a certain socioeconomic level. So there's not a huge amount of diversity in these people, and they don't all speak for humankind. The diversity is in what they're doing as their jobs, really. Their day-to-day life varied quite a bit. And I focused on their inner experiences with words and visual images. Those are the kinds of questions that I would ask. So I opened most of the interviews with the question, I said, when I say the word bridge, do you see anything? And I immediately got some surprises. There was a lot of noise in the system. I actually got the idea for this question from Temple Grandin, who's one of the people I interviewed. And she said if she's trying to get a sense of how well people work with visual imagery, she asked them, what do you see when I ask you to picture a church steeple? And according to her, the people who were the most visually inclined would immediately name a specific steeple somewhere that they could see. Other people would name something more generic, like I think I might see a white steeple, and then there were people who had trouble visualizing anything at all. And so for the bridges, I saw something roughly similar to that. There was a lot of cultural influence. A lot of people said the Brooklyn Bridge or the Golden Gate Bridge, depending upon what coast they were on. And it was clear that they weren't just thinking of their personal experience with this bridge, but images that they encountered every day. There are lots of pictures of the Brooklyn Bridge and the Golden Gate Bridge circulating. I was intrigued by one character who saw people playing bridge. There are always things that you don't plan on. In the interviews, I tried to go from the specific to the abstract. The final question was, what is thought? and which is not something that people could just sit down and start talking about. But I would start out with, if I say, Bridge, do you see anything? Then if you're reading a novel, do you see anything? And if so, what kinds of things do you see? And I would gradually start moving towards harder questions. Some of the other things I would ask are, in your memories, what senses do you think predominate? What catches your attention or your interest? These are very big questions. Okay, so next question was, if you're reading a novel, do you see anything? I got every possible response. I don't read novels, some people said. But I got a lot of variation. One person, this is a prominent literary scholar, who said, well, I couldn't tell you what color hair the characters have. I don't think I'm seeing the characters. And others said, oh, I see everything. And then I have to ask, well, what's everything? What are you seeing? The people who said, I see everything, very often were seeing the characters moving through environments. They would see, they could see what the people looked like and where they were. But there were also some very interesting responses, which I think with them, people haven't read the article yet. They're going to read it afterwards.
Some of them were unable to because
okay.
Our system was down.
Okay. Okay, so if you haven't seen it yet, there's some people who say that they see architecture when they read it. They say, I don't really know what these characters look like, but I know, say they're passing this corner of a building and then they're going to turn this way, or they know what rooms they're in, and they're very concerned with the spaces in which people are conducting their interactions. I spoke to a poet who told me that for her, a poem always begins in a visual image, and she conceived of poetry as a way of using language to communicate images. And the example, she had just been teaching a class, and she said that in class, someone brought up this idea that to her, Chinese characters looked like crows in the snow. I think this comparison offended someone in an audience once, and so I'll just say that I think only a person who doesn't speak or read or write Chinese would make this comparison, but it's not meant to be offensive in any way. This was somebody who doesn't speak or read Chinese and just said that probably for reasons of beauty, the black against the white. And so I understood what was going on in the class, and I understood what she meant when she said that poetry helps people use words to convey images. Okay, so in the last 40 years or so, there's been more and more interest in this quote-unquote visual thinking. There's been more and more praise of it, association of it with creativity. In pop science, there's been more and more praise and visual thinking. And one of the things I want to do by talking to people is get a sense of what is it? What does it involve? And especially for people who are not as familiar with it, or to whom it doesn't come as naturally. There are people who would say, well, visual thinking is a contradiction in terms. Like the guy said who is suspicious of people uncomfortable with verbal language. I mean, this book is partly for him, so he can understand what visual thinking is. So a scientist I spoke to said, well, when I'm doing a biochemistry experiment, I kind of put my mind in the tube, and I go there and I see what the molecules are doing. I said, are you in there? Said, no, I'm not in the tube, but I extend my mind into the tube, and sort of I'm watching different possibilities of what the molecules might be doing in there. One of the novelists I spoke to said, well, when I'm writing, I'm watching what my characters are doing, and then I write it down. That's one approach to writing. It's probably not everybody's approach to writing. So, you may or may not be familiar with the work of Maria Kozhevnikov, very interesting scholar of visual thinking. She's got a lot of evidence that visual thinking is not one phenomenon. She talks about object and spatial visualization. Since the 70s, these questionnaires that are you a visual thinker or are you a verbal thinker? They tended to put people in one category or the other. And people who thought they were visual were coming out to be kind of visual duds because the questions were all focusing on object visualization. You know, can you picture a tree blowing in the wind? And can you picture the details of someone's face? And they were better at spatial arrangements. You're probably, I think probably everybody here is aware of dorsal and ventral streams, and the fact people may or may not be more efficient at processing information than one or the other. And if you're inclined towards spatial visualization, you're good at estimating, say, distances, velocities, relative proportions. Is something moving towards me or away from me? And if you're better at object visualization, you're better at textures, colors, what are the details of an image. So she's found that you know, it doesn't make any sense at all to think of people in terms of verbal or visual cognitive styles, because people who are good at object or spatial or visualization may be as different from each other as somebody who's good at verbal processing. Okay. One of the things I most want to avoid in this work is putting people into buckets, you know, and saying this is a verbal person, this is a visual person. And so some of the other evidence I encountered is that people would talk about ways of thinking that are very important to them, which are very clearly neither, they involve neither visual mental imagery nor verbal language. Running a simulation in your head. One of the guys I spoke to wrote multi-agent software. And he said, well, my thinking consists of running the function in my head. And said, well, are you seeing anything? No. No. Are there any words involved? No. You know, what are you doing? Well, I'm running the simulation. So I had to work to understand what that meant. But it breaks down those two binary categories. Other people talked about thinking in algorithms. And then the flamenco dancer, so she's planning a dance. I thought she was going to tell me that she saw it all, and not at all. It's not at all what was going on for her. She said, she feels it in her body, and she knows to tell other people what to do based on what her body is telling her works. So I thought that was very interesting. Okay, one of the artists that I spoke to, one of the visual artists, whom I am going to name because I'm using his image and I want to make sure he gets credit. His name is Rigoberto Gonzalez. He works in Harlingen, Texas, and he uses Baroque styles and Baroque imagery. He loves Caravaggio. He loves 17th century Spanish and Italian artists, and to him, their techniques, say dramatic differences in lighting, are particularly appropriate for showing what's happening right now on the border with drug massacres. So he uses mythological motifs. He uses ordinary people as models, the way that the Baroque artists did. This is a painting of his called the 17th of February, 17 de Febrero. And he said that he paints because he loves corridos. He loves these ballads that tell stories, but he claims he has no musical talent. I don't know if this is true or not, but he says, with my painting, I can do visual corridos. So he's telling a story through his painting. So, another argument that you can't set visual and verbal thinking up as opposites is that thinking visually involves words, and vice versa. They're connected with each other. Okay, and then another, something I'm very concerned with as a teacher is that if you categorize yourself, if you say, well, I'm a verbal person, or I think I'm a visual person, you may stop trying to do kinds of thinking that don't come easily. And if you force yourself, you can learn all kinds of things. One of the most interesting things I found from this study was that when I asked people, what's the hardest thing you ever had to learn? I say, no, don't tell me any emotional life lesson stories, but say a skill or some kind of intellectual thing. That, what's the hardest thing you had to learn? When they named it, it was very often something close to what they did. A lot of the scientists said calculus or math or quantitative reasoning. Some of the guy was a translator, so learning to read was the hardest thing. He got left back. He had to repeat first grade. One guy told me that, he was also very good with language, said that he thought that reading was a conspiracy and that his mother and older brother were just making up this idea that visual symbols could carry meaning. They were just putting him on. And maybe it is, who knows? But there was this odd sort of correlation that people were going into fields at least related to something that they found very difficult. And one person actually came out and said, things that come easily to me just don't interest me that much. I wouldn't do them. And I don't have data on this. This is a number of people who told me this, and enough to make me suspect. But I would have to do a study before I could make a definitive statement. But I think it's certainly possible, based on what I was hearing, that people don't go into the fields that come easiest to them. Which is why I'm arguing, don't think that your visual or verbal skill level is a destiny. One of the artists said, basically the more she's worked on thinking what does something really look like and then tried to reproduce that with her own hand, the better she's gotten at it. She wasn't born this way, she developed it over time. Okay, then, as I'm sure everybody's aware, your visual environment affects your visual mental imagery. And one of the things that I noticed the scientists telling me, when they would discuss how they develop their ideas, without my cueing them or anything, they were telling me spontaneously that their mental imagery follows to some degree what they're seeing in journals, in textbooks. One woman said, one scientist said, when I think about DNA and protein, I used to see these long, elegant chromosomes, very linear, and over time they've developed all these blobs on them. As we've learned more about all the proteins associated with DNA and chromosomes, her mental images of them are starting to get kind of kinky and covered with blobs, and they no longer have this nice Art Nouveau sinuous curve. So they talked about how their images have followed what they're seeing. Okay, and then of course there's the argument that thinking doesn't occur in individual minds, thinking occurs through interactions. This is kind of a philosophical viewpoint, or a social science viewpoint. So you have to think about whether this is true in your particular case. But one person described this, he was, during the Cold War in the 50s, he was on patrol in the woods along the border between Germany and Czechoslovakia, and what do people do there? Well, they gather mushrooms. And he and another guy had found this very interesting mushroom, and he was holding it up and looking at it, and suddenly the guy who was on patrol with him said, "It looks like a bird." And he had this revealing experience of saying, "Wow, that's just what I wanted to say. You've just spoken my thought, but I didn't know that was my thought until you spoke it." And he came up with this idea, which is, he said it was adopted for a poster by the Southern Christian Leadership Conference in the 60s during the Civil Rights struggle. Which is that, I can see what's behind your head and you can't, and you can see what's behind my head and I can't. But if we both cooperate and talk with each other, then we'll get a fuller picture of what's going on. So that's his approach to thinking, and they warned me about this study that it's not necessarily healthy to think about thought as something that occurs just in individual minds. Okay, so coming to the climax here is, what is thought? I asked everybody. So sometimes I got surprising responses. A literary scholar, people would very often self-identify, they would say, "I'm verbal, I'm the most verbal person on the planet, I'm at the far end of the spectrum." And so a literary scholar who made claims like that defined thought as seeing connections that would produce a structure, which to me sounds awfully spatial. Sometimes people expressed themselves in terms that led me to believe that they were very good spatial thinkers, or that they were inclined in that direction, even if they hadn't defined themselves that way. Another person defined a thought as a picture or a snapshot of something. He was a cell biologist, and he described his thinking as just one image after another. You know, he said that while I'm talking to you, there's this slideshow going on in my head, and that was his experience of thinking. One person called it realization in context, and a filmmaker described it in terms intrinsic to his field, a stream of words or images. Okay. Because I'm a teacher, and probably most of you are also, I was very interested in the results of all of this for teaching. Particularly teaching writing and teaching literature, because that's my field, but I think it can be just as important for teaching cognitive science. So one thing that came up was the use of metaphor in teaching, and how you best communicate using words or using visual images or using words to create visual images. So the flamenco dancer said, if she wants to get somebody's body to do something and they're not understanding it, she often uses an organic metaphor because that's the kind of dance it is. It's a very earthly kind of dance. And she said, well, make sure that your arms are extended like a bird's wing. And if you're really concentrating on that image, if you look closely at the bird's wing, you'll notice that it's not perfectly straight, that it turns down a little bit at the tip. And that's the movement that she wanted. But you have to really concentrate on the image. A salesperson I spoke to said, if she's about to make a pitch and try to sell somebody her software system, she asked herself, well, how do they hear? How do I communicate that way? And then one of the better metaphors for teaching I came across was a developmental biologist who said, well, my job as a teacher is to make sure everybody has the receptor. I can throw as much neurotransmitter at them as I want, and if they don't have the receptor, nothing's going to happen. And so, when I'm teaching a class, the first step is figure what receptors do they have, right? And if they don't have the right ones, then I have to give it to them. Okay. How might we as teachers draw on visual mental imagery in the classroom? Particularly in the teaching of literature, there's been this long-time suspicion of talking about images, even though poets, talk about in their own writing how important that is. There's always been this worry that mental images are somehow private or personal, may contain X-rated material, may contain material that you may not want to hear about in class. But for literary scholars, the main issue has been, well, it'll take people away from the literary work. If you ask people, well, what do you see when you hear this poem? They're going to start talking about their mothers, and they'll be talking about themselves rather than what's there on the page. That's not necessarily true. And I'll talk in a minute about ways to get around that. But some questions to think about are, do people need to form images to understand what they're hearing? And how can you know what somebody else sees? I'm particularly concerned about teaching writing. I'm sure that all of you read a lot of student writing. Some of you may still be doing a lot of student writing, but you're reading it and trying to help people to write better in your field. Gerald Groh, who's at Florida A&M, he teaches design students and architects, and he's done some very interesting work about how the writing of his design and architecture students expresses what's going on in their heads. So often people teaching writing classes love language, they feel great about language, and they can't understand how anybody would not feel the same way. And that's not necessarily the person that you want to be teaching the writing class. You want somebody who can communicate with every person in that room and help them to become better writers. And if you start out presuming that all of your students' thought is really language and it's identical to your thought, that can be a real problem. So his work makes some suggestions about how to get around that and help people understand what visual thinking might be. Elaine Scarry, she's in the English department at Harvard. She's done some collaborative work with Stephen Koslin on visual mental imagery, and the strength of her work is that she asks the question, well, what are writers doing to make people create visual mental images? Because writers vary. A bad writer very often is not so good at encouraging people to see mental imagery. And amazing writers like Tolstoy or Thomas Hardy, they tend to be very good at it. And so she's doing an analysis of, well, what exactly are they doing? And she's noticed patterns. They asked readers to study patterns of reflected light on surfaces. They might move one image in the foreground against another one in the background, but they're manipulating the reader's attention, calling the reader's attention to different kinds of patterns in predictable ways. She calls a poem or novel a set of instructions for mental composition, and she makes a lot of comparisons to music. Say a book might be a musical score, and then the mind of the reader is a symphony orchestra interpreting that musical score. It's going to be different in every case, but the book offers some instructions with some flexibility. So I just want to give you some examples of writers who I think are good at this. Junot Diaz's The Brief Wondrous Life of Oscar Wilde, an amazing book, and I recommended it for everybody. So he's describing a character who's gone to Santo Domingo for the first time. I won't read this whole passage, but I think what the most interesting for me in here is he says the buses, from the outset, they looked like they were making a rush delivery of spare limbs to some far-off war. So you can picture, the arms and legs hanging out of these buses as they're zooming by. They're so crowded. I think that's a very successful image, and he's asking you to picture it as a reader. He's asking you to do some work, and everybody's going to see something different there. But he's managed to design a passage that you're probably going to see something, even if you don't necessarily see exactly what he's seeing. Another good recent book, another contemporary author who I think is pretty skilled at getting people to picture things, is Siri Hasselhed. In her recent novel, The Summer Without Man. She's describing a character, she's sitting on a lawn chair, and there's a fence between her yard and the neighbor's yard, and the fence doesn't go all the way down. So below, towards the bottom of the fence, you can see this little kid moving around. This is a case where you have to have some cultural knowledge to get this, but she says, she was startled by what this kid looked like until I understood that she was wearing a fright wig of some kind, a gnarled platinum concoction that made me think of an electrocuted Harpo Marx. So here's what this wig may have looked like. And you can imagine how dirty and disgusting and beat up this thing is, but it's the kid's security blanket, and she won't ever take off this platinum blonde wig. So again, she's encouraging you to see something. And readers, some readers have said, well, that's the pleasure of reading. That's why I like to read. I'm in it for the imagery. And other people are in it for other reasons. Okay, so a few general conclusions. Visual and verbal thinking, they're not uniform, they're not opposites, they're not distinct categories, they overlap. I don't think it's a great idea to describe people as visual or verbal. There is evidence, say, from Maria Koziadnikov that they're to some degree, loosely there are cognitive styles, and there would be object and spatial visualization and verbal. But I think as we do more work, these categories are going to open up, and verbal. What is verbal? That's not one skill. There are people who are good at hearing and reproducing language. There are people who are good at writing stories. There are people who are good at recreating arguments. There are people who notice the sound of language more, the rhythm of it. There's so many different aspects of it. And the same, I was just talking with somebody earlier today about, spatial visualization is probably going to turn out to be maybe 20 different skills, a whole lot of different things. It's not one thing. And then finally, anybody can develop any of these skills with practice. You may not become a virtuoso, but it's very dangerous to identify yourself in one way because you stop working at the things that you think you're terrible at. Okay, and then for teaching, I think that if we have conversations about visual mental imagery in the classroom, whether we're talking about English, whether we're talking about psychology, it may engage students who were never interested before. And if we take people's mental images seriously, say if we try to connect creative writing with analytical approaches to literature or to other fields, we're just going to generate more interest than we might otherwise get. So I should, let's see, this is where to find me if you ever want to find me online. And I should thank, not just UC Merced, but my university for letting me do studies like this when I'm in an English department. Not everybody would put up with this. And the Max Planck Institutes where I've worked now for human development, but for a much longer time, the Max Planck Institute for the History of Science, where I've also been a long-standing guest. So thanks very much, everybody, and I look forward to your questions.